Okay. Good morning, everyone. Everyone hearing me okay? Well, thank you for choosing our session. I know you had a lot of choices, tough choices to make, so thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Lorenzo Baber. I'm joined by my colleague, Naomi Simmons-Thorne, and together we represent the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, which I'll talk about in a second. But today we're presenting on infusing culturally relevant pedagogy in campus equity plans. So just a little bit about OCCRL, just a shameless plug. The Office of Community College Research and Leadership is one of the oldest research organizations, centers, dedicated specifically to community college research and practice. We're embedded at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, but we work with all the community colleges and as well as the system office, the Illinois Community College Board, and the Illinois Board of Higher Education on multiple aspects related to supporting practice at community colleges, including college success, faculty development, administrative leadership, and policy development. So we're here today to talk a little bit about campus equity plans and infusing culturally relevant pedagogy. But before we go into the weeds, and Naomi will present on kind of the details of culturally relevant pedagogy, we wanted to start with just a 30,000-foot landscape view of why it's important to think about equity in general and what Illinois is doing specifically in that area. So we all know that we're towards the end of our 60 by 2025 agenda. This was started initially in 2009, and one of his first addresses to the joint Congress, then President Obama highlighted the need for increasing credentials among working adults. At that point in 2009, the United States had fallen 11th in the world in the number of working adults, 25 to 64, with a post-secondary credential. All the way through the early 90s, we had been, between World War II, when we emphasized higher education out of World War II and into the Cold War, we had been number one, first in the world in the number of working adults with a post-secondary credential. By 2009, we had fallen to 11th in the world. And so then President Obama, and this has been a bipartisan effort through multiple presidential administrations, but Obama first established this goal of, 60% by 2025, which meant 60% of working adults would have a post-secondary credential, which was defined as a short-term certificate or higher by 2025. And as you can see from this, whoops, no, you can't see because my computer's trying to restart. Sorry about that. Don't you just love computers and their timing? All right. Oh no, I just unplugged it. I was just going to plug it back in. Hope that did it. There we go. All right. Whew. Glad you can see that beautiful graphic there that I didn't make. I just copied and pasted, but still it deserves attention. So this is by geographic, divided by state, the percentage. So you can see overall that we are not going to reach that goal of 60% by 2025. There are some states that will, most notably Minnesota and Colorado. In Illinois, we're at about 57%. So we're actually above the national. We also fall short of the 60%. However, we are above the national average of about 54% overall. But that's just, you can see some of the diversity there. Some of the more nuanced statistics, you can see that, again, 57% in Illinois, which exceeds the national average, but falls below that 60% by 2025. However, much of this average is carried by 4 counties: DuPage, McLean, Champaign, and Lake. So if you know, DuPage is a suburb of Chicago. McLean is where Illinois State is. Champaign County is obviously where U of I is. And then Lake County, which is a northern suburb of Chicago. The remaining counties have, including Cook County overall, have rates below both the state and national average. And as you can see, we have, there are actually 7 counties with more than 100,000 people and less than a 50% post-secondary attainment rate. And some counties, as you'll see in the next slide, the post-secondary attainment rate is as low as 23%. And again, we're talking about a short-term credential or higher. So the need for increasing equity, even though you could argue Illinois is ahead of the curve nationally, as we say, aggregate success is not equitable success. There are still counties and demographics that are below the average, and you can see, particularly for Black and Latinx populations, the attainment rate is 34 and 23% respectively, and we know that Latinx populations in particular are the fastest growing population in the state. And then among working adults, we have almost 11% that have some college but no credential, and that's actually higher than the number of people who have associate's degrees. So again, this couches why it's important to think about equity overall, and the reason why the state is emphasizing equity plans, not just thinking about the overall average, but thinking about disparate outcomes related to racialized background, geographic location, economic status, and returning adult status as well. So this is a slide we put together at OCCRL that kind of shows you the gap. And as I said, actually I went over it. So Alexander County, which is at the bottom tip of the state, which Cairo, if you know anything about Cairo, right on the border of Kentucky, their post-secondary attainment rate's about 17%, which means, and that's about, I think there are about 90,000 households in that county. So when we think about, what we always argue at OCCRL is that we don't really think about the aggregate, right? The aggregate, because the aggregate can hide a lot of overall. What we say is always, if we can improve Alexander County and these other counties on the list, then we will do better overall, right? So not focusing on the aggregate, but focusing on the areas that are low on the spectrum. We also argue that this is not meant to be a culturally deficit perspective on these counties or areas or the families or the demographics, that this is a reflection of the structural deficiencies that we have in our system. And of course, that system of, it's not just education, but all the other social services that are related to that, but that we have a unique responsibility to focus on these areas and the demographics that reflect these areas through our work in education and specifically community colleges. So, why culturally relevant pedagogy as a potential lever for change? So we know, you've heard a lot of this about sense of belonging. How many have heard this, the sense of belonging, right? Structuring sense of belonging. So we argue that that culturally relevant pedagogy is one of these areas that help infuse a sense of belonging, and that outside of just not separate from the other aspect, academic development, knowledge acquisition, but that these are all related concepts to learn better, to create or develop better skills, study habits. You really have to start with affirming that place, right? That you belong in this place first. And our students need to understand that, and the more that they can see themselves in the curriculum, in the teaching, and the pedagogy, the more they're likely to have that affirmation. And that we also call this term validation, right? And that this validation isn't, again, is you're not lucky to be here. This is not a fortunate opportunity for you. You belong here. And that it's our responsibility to show the ways that you belong here and to connect your sense of knowing to the practices that we know will demonstrate success. And we argue that culturally relevant pedagogy is that link, right? So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague who will talk a little bit about the components of culturally relevant pedagogy. Anyway.
All right, thank you. Just by a show of hands, how many people would say they know something or have heard something about CRP, culturally relevant pedagogy? Okay, perfect. All right, so most of us have some kind of idea about CRP, Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. However, there are a growing sense of research about the need for CRP in the CTE space. And so traditionally, historically, CTE has not been a place where CRP interventions or focuses have really been streamlined, but there's a growing sense that that needs to change for some of the reasons that we'll get into in the presentation. So I want to give you just a little bit of a panoramic view about why this sentiment has arisen and how a little bit about how researchers and practitioners are responding to it. And so I think it's really important first to kind of make this distinction that you see up there between aims and ends. And so oftentimes in education, we can be very prescriptive. So oftentimes we talk about what needs to be done, what should be done, what to do, and sometimes we don't just zoom out a little bit and talk about why should we be doing those things. So that's the aims and ends distinction. Oftentimes in the classroom, we are operating on the aims level. We're talking about what we want our students to know, what we want our students to understand, what we want them to be able to do. But we also need to talk about ends, the reasons why we want those things to happen, whether it's economic well-being, whether it's because we want to cultivate lifelong learners, whatever those ends are. It's important to think about those things. And so together, our aims and ends kind of shape our values, and the values of CTE have been changing. And so currently, there are two kind of big values that are guiding the CTE space. One of them, of course, is quality assurance and accountability. This really gets ahead in the 1980s with The Nation at Risk, but also equity has become more important. Questions about equal access, anti-bias, proportional achievement, those things have increasingly become important in the CTE space. And so culturally relevant pedagogy, like Dr. Baber mentioned, is one of the levers that we have for promoting that in the CTE space. All right. So just a little bit about culturally relevant pedagogy itself, defining it as well. So CRP goes under many names, and so there's many ways of conceptualizing it, there's many ways of theorizing it, and so here are some of the various ways that you might hear scholars and practitioners talking about CRP. But what kind of brings all of them together is essentially CRPs are trying to promote student achievement by integrating elements of students' cultural backgrounds into facets of the learning process. So that can be curriculum, it could be the learning environment. Oftentimes in K-12, there's conversations about discipline in CRP. And so CRP, however you want to conceptualize it, that is the aim. What we're trying to do is promote student achievement, and we're trying to do that by being sensitive to students' cultural backgrounds, because those cultural backgrounds inform the educational process, as you can see in the chart. Thinking styles and ways of interacting with your educator and study habits, and all these things have cultural bases, and so CRP is a tool that educators can use to be sensitive to that and leverage that in the classroom for student achievement. All right, so this right here, it's a little tinier than what I thought it would be, but that's okay. So we're gonna start talking a little bit about the components and principles of CRP and how we're thinking about applying them in the CTE space. And of course, we can't get into all the weeds here, but what I wanna do is just kind of provoke some, some areas and get us thinking about some areas where we might start thinking about implementing these things. And so what we have here on the right-hand side is a couple of the 16 career pathways / career clusters, and some of these principles of CRP, what CRP is trying to do. And so sense of belonging, as Dr. Baber talked about, is one of those CRP principles. And so what we want to do with CRP in terms of responding to our students' cultural backgrounds is making them feel welcomed in the classroom, making them feel welcomed in educational spaces, and making sure that our students don't feel that they have to leave themselves or parts of themselves outside the door to get an education. And so sense of belonging is really important in the CTE space because CTE historically has careers have historically catered to some groups more than others, and it might take a little bit more for certain groups to feel like they can engage or matriculate in a career pathway as opposed to other groups. And so I know we often think about that in terms of race and ethnicity, but that's not the only dimensions that we have to think about as well. For example, early childhood education has historically been a female profession. If you have male students in your classroom, how are you going to create a sense of belonging for them? We often talk about women in the trades and promoting a sense of belonging there as well. So race and ethnicity, of course, are important elements, and I think those are elements that people are more familiar with, but there are other dimensions as well, gender, ability, and so on, that we also have to think about when we're cultivating a sense of belonging. Another really important thing is academic self-concept. And so what this essentially is referring to is the ability for a student to see themselves aligning, identity alignment between the student and whatever their career pathway is. Do they have a strong sense of being able to achieve and be whatever it is that they're setting out to be. And so fostering academic self-concept can come in various kinds of ways, and it's also important to foster that. And so we can think about this as making sure that students are able to see themselves as whatever that profession is. So whether that means bringing in professionals from marginalized backgrounds, whether that means fostering relationships with professional communities that promote minority achievement, whatever it is important for students to be able to see themselves as attaining that profession. And historically, all professions have been welcoming to all people. And so being able to foster that academic self-concept is really important. And last thing is critical consciousness. And so critical consciousness is, in short, the ability to be able to identify injustices and biases, and being able to work to change those things. And so when you think about critical consciousness in the CTE space, what you really want to think about is the past injustices that have informed professions, the way that certain professions operate in certain communities, and the relationships certain professions have in certain communities. A really important example would be, for example, law enforcement. If you are teaching criminal justice in a CTE space, there are many students who are going to come into your classroom with various kinds of relationships, perhaps even hostilities to criminal justice and those conversations. And so being honest about the ways that your profession have excluded people, harmed communities, and helping your students believe that they can be part of the change in their profession is important. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about putting CRP into action. So what are the things that you can do to actually foster this sense of belonging, this academic self-concept, and this critical consciousness? And so one of the things, of course, is high academic expectations. Oftentimes people think that CRP, the goal of CRP or one of the outcomes of CRP means lowering academic expectations, but that's completely opposite. We don't want to engage in the bias and prejudice of low expectations, so keeping those high expectations are important. But there are certain ways that CRP seeks to do that. So for example, Does your profession incentivize a certain way of thinking about problems? Does it incentivize certain kind of thinking styles? What you want to do is make sure that you are articulating that to your students and making that apparent. You're not leaving it up to students to kind of guess how to fit into the profession. You're letting them know these are the expectations, and you're helping bridge you're helping them bridge where they come from to where they want to be and where they want to go. Cultural competence, of course, is another important one. And so here, this is where a lot of folks tend to see CRP operating, but it's not the only place. So altering the curriculum, of course, is one way of fostering CRP in the classroom. But also some important things are using students as funds of knowledge. And so when we're talking about students as funds of knowledge, this is recognizing that different communities bring different skills, expertise, background knowledge to the classroom, and that can be leveraged for student achievement. So if, for example, a certain community might have an emphasis on being handy, an emphasis on childcare, whatever it is, you can leverage that in the classroom and use that to promote student achievement. And the last one, of course, is fostering relationships between school and community. And so here, of course, we just don't want students to feel like in order to be something, what I have to do is to deny a part of myself, to leave a part of myself out of the classroom, to leave it outside of the door of the school. It's important to foster those relationships between the school and the community so that so we can educate whole students and students can feel whole in our classrooms. And of course, lastly, critical consciousness, what we talked about, being able to develop that sensitivity to injustices, but not just being able to identify them, also promoting change, helping your students develop that sense of being change agents in their professions. And so here, I often use the example of my sister. So my sister is in construction trade, and her professor, which I think is a fantastic example, was able to connect her to women in construction advocacy groups, and she has been able, through that pathway, to be able to both develop her academic self-concept, but also she has been going around the state of South Carolina, where my sister lives, talking to legislators and other folks about the importance of advocating for women in the trades. And so it's important to help your students get that sense that they can be part of the change in their profession, and they can change how they come into the profession as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So moving on, so how does this relate to the equity plan, right? So how many of you were involved in the submission of the equity plan for your institution last spring? Okay, a few. Okay, so just, you know this, but just for you others, hopefully you're all familiar with the equity plan. So last, or 2 years ago, the state legislator, as part of Thriving Illinois, which is our strategic plan for higher education in the state, required each institution to submit an equity plan. And this was a plan designed for institutions to identify equity gaps disaggregated by demographic background of that institution's, based on that institution. So it could be racialized equity gaps, it could be gender equity gaps, it could be class, socioeconomic background, or it could be a combination, intersection of those, disability as well, and craft a plan around how to address those gaps. And so for us, we're thinking about, particularly in CTE, one way to reduce these equity gaps or a potential is a structure and infusion of culturally relevant pedagogy in CTE. particularly because we know that many instructors in CTE tend to come from industry, so they don't have a background in teaching or pedagogy. They're very good at developing technical skills in the field, in the trade, but not necessarily thinking about pedagogy and teaching. And again, we don't come, just like we don't look at students from a deficit perspective, we don't look at instructors from a deficit perspective. That this is not necessarily a thing that we expect them to have, but a thing that we need to develop, a tool that we need to develop in concert with the skills that they are bringing into the classroom around training in these technical aspects. And so why we think about culturally relevant pedagogy, and Naomi mentioned this before, is that we know that there is a significant, this is from research, that there's a significant relationship between perceptions of campus climate and cultural congruency, or that, again, that seamlessness between I don't have to leave a part of me at the door to enter this classroom space, and that's particularly heightened for underrepresented student populations. We also know that students are more likely to retain key concepts when faculty or instructors relate academic work or training, technical training, to students' interest. Also helps students connect learning to their conceptual experiences and facilitate collaboration among students on application of concepts to real-world problems. And we also know, especially for community colleges, culturally relevant pedagogy is important because many times the classroom space is the only campus space that they experience, right, as students who are mobile. And so faculty are then primarily the institutional agents or the validating agent that they interact with, and that classrooms may be, for many students, the most significant, not just academic space, but sociocultural space. So again, it emphasizes the need to think about culturally relevant pedagogy. So when we think about infusing culturally relevant pedagogy and equity plans, and one thing, in full disclosure, I was on the equity plan workforce task force. So for those of you who submitted it, if you want to attack me later about like what exactly was this, but to note that this is an annual report. And so the first year, as part of that working, I admit that, you know, it's a work in progress in terms of what we're asking you to submit. But one of the things as we kind of narrow and be more sharp in our both request as well as the development of these plans is thinking specifically about act practices and policies that lever equity. And again, we would argue culturally relevant pedagogy is one of those levers. But it is a long-term lever, right? It is about faculty development first. It's thinking about the challenges around how faculty will feel in terms of a policy around culturally relevant pedagogy, giving them the tools, thinking about it in terms of what that might mean for their student evaluations as they try out new forms of pedagogy, and understanding that and kind of reducing that tension is also important. So what we thought we'd do is for the next 15 minutes or so is to break you up into small groups, because we don't want to just sit here and talk to you. And so we have some questions, and for those in the virtual space, you'll just have a group on your own. And so thinking about some aspects of culturally relevant teaching that you've already seen in the classroom, what success stories are you willing to share with the larger group? What you see from your perspective as the biggest challenges for structuring culturally relevant teaching through campus policy and practice. So what maybe potential strategies there are that you've employed or you thought about in overcoming these challenges. And then, of course, the big question, the elephant in the room that we always get when we do this presentation is, how is culturally relevant pedagogy related to my field, right? Like, how can I infuse it in a class on getting a commercial driver's license? Like, where is that fit, or where is that connection? And so thinking about that and how you would react to that question. I mean, we have our perspectives, but we're curious about, A, do you think that's true? Do you think every class can, or every course can infuse culturally relevant pedagogy or teaching? Why or why not? And if you do, what potential feedback would you give to those who may say otherwise? Does that make sense? So I think we had, oh, go ahead, yes, please. Please speak.
Really quickly with that last question as well, you can also, and I encourage you to think beyond the curriculum. The curriculum is just one dimension of CRP. There are other dimensions as well. So remember what we were talking about, critical consciousness, we were talking about sense of belonging. Think about those other dimensions as well, and not just the curriculum.
Thank you. So we'll take about 15 minutes. I think we have natural small groups through your table, or you can also turn chairs around if you'd like to go to tables either in front of you or behind you. So, and we'll keep track, and then we'll come back together and see if there's some kind of grand narratives that cut across the small group discussions. Thank you. Nice job. All right, we'll take about 2 more minutes just to wrap up conversations, and we'll come back together.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and come back together as a group. So you all we're having some really good conversations over here. I heard like a conversation about like college culture. Over here, I heard some conversations about all the different kinds of identities that we have to be mindful of when we're doing CRP work and efforts. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of return to these 3 questions, and we're going to share some of those conversations that we were having. And so we're going to start with the first question about what aspects of CRP are successful in the classroom, and you're going to tell us a little bit about some of your observations and what you think might be helpful for other educators and practitioners to know. So would anyone like to get us started with that first question? Any group?
I think I have the microphone. So for our audience virtually, we just need to use the microphone so they can hear. So anybody want to start us off? I feel like this group had a lot of
I know, I heard some really good conversations. So I'm like, where's the silence coming from?
We're not going to pick on anybody, but any insights? Okay, we'll go. Oh, yeah, we'll start here, and then I'll go to you, Camille.
Our discussion was not necessarily about the classroom, but it was about the institution and how do we be role models, because the group that we have here, we don't teach in the classroom, but we are some of the support people that the students will see and need along the way. And how do we role model this behavior so that other individuals will also want to see the strengths that our students bring to us and be able to share our culture with them, but also being able to take advantage of their strengths because they bring a lot to the classroom also.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I used to work as in instructional support as well in community college, specifically doing English tutoring. And I remember a lot of times instructors would just kind of pass off the CRP expectations and efforts onto instructional support. And so oftentimes we have or are playing sometimes more of a role than the instructors themselves.
Awesome. So my table was like 2 tables combined into one. We had so many good things to say. But one of the things that the group kind of challenged me to think about was thinking about culture in as broadly as I could. So not only thinking about gender and whether a certain gender is representative in that particular CTE program, but also, I think about my brother who's a cosmetologist. He was definitely not the norm in his program. But I think also about, as one of my lovely thought partners brought up, what are we doing for our adult learners? Are they being normalized in our curriculum? Are they being normalized in our advertising? What are we doing to make sure that students' experiences don't feel like something that they need to hide? Where are we thinking about race? How are we thinking about class? How are we thinking about normalizing access to resources? Because it's a perfectly normal thing for students to have multiple complex realities that meet in the classroom. So how are we making access to those things just readily available and taking away some of that pressure of students to disclose which part of their identities are seeking that belonging?
Great, and I think both those comments really pick up on this idea of structure versus individual practice. So yes, we want individuals to practice cultural relevancy, whether it's teaching, leadership, and practice, but we have to make sure that it doesn't stop there, that what are we doing structurally to amplify those individual practices and then make that the institutional norm rather than an outside a thing that individuals do, but when that individual either leaves or moves on, that those practices go away with that person. That's really what we're trying to do in terms of thinking about it from a structural perspective. We certainly appreciate the individual focus, and it's just a matter of how do we create a structure for those that individual attention that's always been there is now the norm, right, and normalized, and it's actually abnormal not to be culturally relevant, right? Yep. Here and then there.
One of the practices that we use in our classrooms just to learn more about our students or for them to learn about each other is a practice called civic reflection. And I'm going to read it just so that I don't say it inappropriately, but civic reflection is a conversation model that uses shared sources such as poems, images, or film excerpts to help groups of people think and talk more deeply about their shared world and differing values and commitments. And so we will use this in our RLA, when we're just doing onboarding, really as things are coming up in the news, and we feel like the tension is high, and it's like, okay, now it's the time for us to really sit and have and do this and have these conversations. And the facilitator really tries not to sway the conversations. It's the facilitator is supposed to listen to the way that the conversation is going in the group and then can take questions that they've sort of prepared just to make sure that it stays on track and people don't get heated and it doesn't get too emotional, but it also allows for people to learn about each other and their environments and how they're feeling. So it's been really good for us. We've been doing it for about 8 years now.
That's really helpful, and that goes back to the critical consciousness piece in helping students be able to identify those injustices, those structures that are operating in our society.
And to your point, one of our colleagues in our group mentioned something about it being the norm, but ideally it would be great if it's institutional-wide, but she also mentioned community-wide.
Yes.
It would be great if it's something that isn't something that's implemented and then gone when someone leaves, that it's something, that institutions are holding themselves accountable with, but ideally, I think you mentioned, communities. It'd be great if we're modeling that in the community. But all of this makes me think that it's about a mindset, right? And so that mindset takes time to develop and to kind of adhere, so that it goes from something that's an initial practice to something that is a regular practice.
Yeah, and I think that also reminds me that this is holistic, right? And it starts from even starting with like interview questions when you're interviewing new instructors, that you have a question of how do you infuse sense of belonging in the classroom as an interview question that everybody gets asked, right? Now, the answer might vary, and it may be that that is a question that is very difficult to answer, but just the attempt of answering that sets a tone that this is something that's expected of me. I may not have the right answer in my interview, but I know that if I get this position, I'll have to work on it. All the way to the end where you have surveys and you're asking students, do you feel a sense of belonging on campus, right? That's the connected from like an initial kind of practice all the way to the ways in which it's being evaluated. I think that what we're trying to do with the equity plan is there longitudinally a plan, like year 2, next year, we're starting to ask this question, and then in year 5, we're going to evaluate this question and see if there's a difference in terms of students' outcomes by starting to ask this question in 2025, right? That's the kind of evidence that we want to see, or that I would encourage you to think about as inputting in the equity plan. And then to your point, how has that helped improve our trust and engagement with particular communities that haven't seen themselves at our campus, at our college, right? That's the kind of holistic approach that we want to see, that cultural relevancy helps support, right? So.
One of the things that we are trying to encourage, especially on some of the CTE programs, to promote a sense of belonging, is to even look at your equipment. So for instance, if you're in your welding program, if your masks, if your gloves are really large and you have a female student, what is that micro message you're telling? You literally do not fit in. So it's something very small that can be changed. And then on the opposite end, let's say in healthcare, which is primarily for female traditionally female students, you order small, medium gloves, but then for male students, that's that same message, you don't fit in. And so these are little things that can help move that needle and create a sense of belonging. So if we really look at micro messaging, what are we telling our students? What are we showing them?
When we're advertising a class, if we are putting women in like a healthcare situation, what are we saying? That's a traditional thing for women and men shouldn't apply. And so if we're looking at something like that, even just in our publicity materials, we need to be really cognizant of that.
Yeah, I think our keynote speaker talked a little bit about that yesterday in terms of that bias and that, that you definitely want to emphasize, right? Especially if you have a demographic that has been historically underrepresented in a particular field, right? But I like that term micro messaging because I think that is a key concept in cultural relevance, that it isn't just the grand experiences that students have, it's those little things that then build up to those bigger things. So it may be the glove size, might be just the last thing, right, after other micro aggressions or micro messaging, that just the lever to say, you know what, I actually don't belong here. This is the 3rd thing or 5th thing that's happened to me this week. Whereas we might say, well, that just seems like a minor thing. But if you build up a couple of minor things, that might be the thing that tips over in terms of their decision not to come back to the classroom or re-enroll. And yes, yeah. And it's a minor thing to fix and to address, right? And I think that's also, sometimes we get maybe focused too much on the big things and not thinking about those big things are actually a microcosm of a lot of small things. So Thank you. Any other? Yes.
One thing we realized recently on our campus when we talk about our nursing programs, our mannequins, our arms were all white. We're from rural Illinois, 98% white, but they were all white. So how does someone feel if that doesn't look like them?
Excellent point. Thank you. We got about a couple more minutes, maybe time for 1 or 2 more comments. Yes. I'm going to run over here for our audience. All right, thank you.
So I've seen some really good examples in the classroom of using culturally relevant teaching. I'm in the CTE space, and so while I think it's wonderful to see things like stories and examples that are, non-traditional, for lack of a better word, or, seeing images that kind of, buck the traditional norms that we've historically seen in the classroom. All of those are good things. But one of the things that I continually am challenged by is I recruit and hire adjunct faculty, and it can happen on such a short notice. And a lot of times I'm bringing in people from industry who are so good at their craft, so good at it, but they need so much help just becoming good teachers. And so it's all the things from classroom management to also things like this. And we do have challenges with being able to achieve this. And I'm just wondering if anybody here, if your institution has trainings or some sort of mentoring, some sort of support for adjunct faculty, because I just feel like they miss out on so much of the professional development that can be available to our full-timers.
It's an easy reach. I can just say that we actually use Perkins funds to ensure that we have new faculty and adjuncts that are mentored. That's a regular thing that we do, and it is so appreciated because sometimes you're getting in a wave of new people, right? And it's so important that they have somebody that they can go to, somebody who can talk with them about things like this, who's an established faculty member. So, I mean, that's one way you could leverage funds to make something like that happen. Thank you.
I was just going to say that what I hear our faculty doing is using our department chairs, and with those chairs, they're mentoring those incoming faculty and adjuncts to provide them with some of those resources. So along the lines of what you just said.
All right, so a person online talked about, and I want to acknowledge our online colleagues, had a question about ILIA, which I forgot what it stands, Illinois. It's from the Partnership for College Completion. So they've been doing equity plans for a couple years. So I encourage you on the PCC website, Partnership for College Completion. They have all the list of all the equity plans that they've been working on for the last couple years and seeing how they infuse culturally relevant pedagogy. So I just want to acknowledge that. Also on the last slide, just give out, well, yeah, there we go. OCCRL. So we have done professional development around culturally relevant pedagogy. We also have Rock Valley, Lincoln Land were our last two institutions that we worked with. We also have publications on our website. Actually, in our last update newsletter, which you can sign up for, and Sal Nudo is our communications lead, who does a great job with all our publications. But in our last update magazine, which is our biannual update, we do have an article on culturally relevant pedagogy and CTE, so I encourage you to look at that. And always feel free to reach out to us if for any support on this topic particularly, and we'd be happy to help support either informally or formally as part of professional development days for your institution. I found that when I do this training for CTE faculty, the first, I will say, they come in kind of like, ugh, I gotta, this culture, I don't know what this is. And then you explain it to them and they're like, oh, this is like good teaching, and this is a thing that I kind of didn't know I needed, I just didn't know that's what you call it, right? And then there's this idea of, well, how do I, because most instructors, they want to be better instructors, right? They want to, and so again, it's not that cultural deficit of like, you're a bad instructor because you don't know CRP, but you don't know what you don't know, right? And so again, asking that question, the initial interview might give a symbolic meaning behind it, but then what's the work that they have to do, the support that they get. So it's all that concept of challenge and support that we talk about with students, we also talk about instructors, right? We want to challenge them to infuse culturally relevant pedagogy in their teaching, but we also have to support that mechanism by giving them the tools and the space to develop it. So again, we hope that this will leverage your practice, and particularly as you think ahead to future equity plans of how to get this into the equity plan at your institution, how to measure it, how to assess it, as a way of closing those equity gaps that we've seen at the beginning of this presentation. So any other last comments? All right. So I want to give Naomi a shout out because this is her second. She's a graduate research assistant. She's 2 for 2 in the Forum for Excellence presentations. So let's give Naomi a shout out. Yep. I'll pass it over to Sal, who's our communications manager, who'll.
This was unexpected, but this URL actually, it's not working right now because we recently switched newsletters. But if you want to go to our website and you can scroll all the way down, there's a subscribe button to get our newsletter.
Thanks, Al.
And I will update our slide too, Sal. Thank you. Yeah. All right. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. We'll stick around for any questions that you have. And also online, thank you for those who participated virtually.